Welcome to this evening's IIEA YPN. I'm seeing lots and lots of some familiar faces, but also lots and lots of familiar faces. I was wondering maybe for our guest here, I was wondering if anyone could indicate if they're new to the YPN, if this is the first time, just like a quick show of hands.
Oh,
so lots and lots of new people joining today. So I'm really delighted that we're able to host this conversation with Feargal O'Rourke, discussing Ireland's competitiveness in a time of geoeconomic uncertainty. So what we might do, just for format, is Feargal, I might ask Feargal one or two questions just to start, maybe get the ball rolling.
Nice, easy ones now. You know?
Yeah, exactly. Nothing complicated. But if any questions do come, if anything comes into your mind or there's something pressing you'd like to ask, just raise your hand and I'll take a note of it, and one of my colleagues will bring a microphone to you when I call upon you. So what I might do very quickly, is I'll introduce Feargal and then we'll begin the conversation. So Feargal O'Rourke currently serves as Chairperson of IIEA Ireland, the state agency responsible for foreign direct investment. But he also serves as chair of the board of the IIEA. Previously, Feargal was managing partner of PwC in Ireland from 2015 until 2023. And then over a 37-year career, he specialised in foreign direct investment, focusing on assisting US-based companies to set up in Ireland and Europe. And while at PwC, he led their tax practice and was heavily involved in the OECD BEPS process. So Feargal, what I was hoping maybe open with a very general question just to kind of kick things off, which is we see this possibility of a trade war between Europe and the US. We see this potential for tariffs. And I understand that at a meeting today, the Taoiseach indicated that there was going to be a tariff deal or a trade deal up until quite recently between Europe and the US. And I guess what I was wondering, maybe could you frame in your own thoughts on how exposed Ireland's economy might be, especially with the multinational sector, how exposed FDI is, should there be kind of the inability to reach a trade deal between Europe and between the EU and the US?
Okay, first of all, you left out our older book on Irish Rugby, which is probably my biggest achievement in the last couple of years. Yeah, I want to put the trade and the tariffs though in a bit of context, because when I took over as chairman of IIEA in January of 24, we were just starting off on our strategy, our 5-year strategy. And at the time we were doing that, I suppose the Trump administration was still a far distance away. It might was going to happen, maybe it wasn't going to happen. And as we surveyed the landscape back in January of 24, we saw a lot of different things happening. We saw that foreign direct investment was actually slowing down globally. We'd probably seen that we had passed the high watermark of globalization probably 2 or 3 years, 4 or 5 years back, actually, at this point. We'd seen the impact of war and pandemic on supply chains. So supply chains became much shorter. There was a lot more friend-shoring and near-shoring than the previous global supply chains that we saw. We saw countries taking a much more muscular approach to industrial policy than they would have had before. And by that, I mean, we saw the US CHIPS Act trying to encourage chip manufacture in the US, and we saw the European response to that. We saw countries that weren't really in the foreign direct investment market before it started to get into it. So, for example, in the last 18 to 24 months, a number of Middle Eastern companies like the UAE and Saudi Arabia are offering large sums of money to companies to go to relocate there. We're seeing the rise of digital skills. We're seeing the rise of AI. We're seeing, as I said, this much more increased competition for foreign direct investment. And on top of all that, we're seeing tariffs and we're seeing the impact of the current US administration. So as I've said to people recently, if all I had to worry about wearing my IIEA chair hat was tariffs, actually, it wouldn't be too bad at all. But there's an awful lot happening out there at the moment. And even on the issue of AI, you really feel, talking to companies in the last 6 or 8 months, it's past that tipping point, and that its adoption by companies now is accelerating. And I mean, when I talk to companies now, the instructions they're getting from headquarters is, how can you be quicker, faster, better, smarter, use digital skills, use AI skills to be more efficient in your operation. So the tariffs, do I wake up every night worrying about the tariffs? Not every night. And, there's no doubt tariffs I know President Trump said that tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language. It's not from the point of view of global trade. And I think that, Europe are united in saying, tariffs are not good for anybody. And a small open economy that depends on inward investment and export orientated, it's really bad news. The optimist in me believes that by the end of this calendar year, we will have a deal. And it'll be, I think it'll be more than about just tariffs, because if you see in recent weeks, the OECD now, the global tax deal that has been reached over the last couple of years is now getting recast a little bit, primarily at the behest of the US to allow their companies benefit from their existing regimes there. I hope and believe and pray that by the end of this calendar year, a global trade deal involving tax, tariffs, data privacy and social media platforms, and a wide variety of other things will be brought in. I still think, though, in 6 months' time, we will be looking at a 10% baseline tariff. I think that's now baked into the US psyche and the US system. So if it were, as the president has indicated, a 30% tariff, I think you've all read enough in the last couple of weeks to say this is going to be bad news for Ireland. The one thing I would say, where are we exposed? We're exposed probably in two areas. One is in the area of the amount of tax we collect, and the other is in the area of jobs. In the area of jobs, some of you may have seen the IIEA released its half-year results there a couple of weeks back, and we actually had a better half-year results for the first half of calendar 25 than we did for the first half of calendar 24. Now, slight caveat, a lot of those investment decisions would have been taken at the back end of 2024, so maybe we haven't seen the full impact of the change of administration. But the message we've sent back via our client base here, ultimately back to the US government, is it's not possible to relocate, for example, pharmaceuticals back to America. You just can't pick up a plant. And even the pharma companies will say to you, even if we wanted to move back to the US in the morning, it would take somewhere between 4 and 5 years to get a plant up and running, fully functional at the moment. So am I concerned, if I give you 3 areas of potential concern, am I concerned about swinging job losses in the morning as people relocate to the US? That just is not physically able to happen. Am I worried about future investment dollars where decisions have been taken right now, probably more of those been invested back in the US in the future? Possibly, yes. I think certainly while we're seeing a continued flow of projects, there are a couple of capital projects that various pharma companies announced back in the US that lead me to say, maybe it's not as, could be losing out a bit there, but gaining in projects like AI and digital projects. And the final bit is the tax we're collecting at the moment. And President Trump has identified his focus is on US companies manufacturing abroad and then selling back into the US. That's where his real focus is. And there are a number of pharma companies here that do that. So, as when I talked about a big deal done at the end of the year, by the end of the year, I think in part of that deal, some of our tax is under threat, because I think, the Americans may say, well, if we can't have the jobs back, some of that profit you're making in Ireland, which has been made by US companies, selling back into the US, and you Ireland are collecting the tax, we'd like to collect the tax on that. So that may be in the pot as well. So it's a little bit mixed. If we end up with a 30% tariff, it's not good news. I hope, pray, believe we won't end up there, but there's still a bit of navigating to be done over the next few months, and we're behind our European friends and allies as we do it.
It's really interesting. So, we touch on such a wide range of areas, and I will say my own background is not in geoeconomics. I work on defense primarily, but this is worth
plumbing area.
But tariffs really does feature in that conversation. I think it kind of really has a hold on people's minds. But I'm thinking a little bit about, like you said, all these different areas that we need to look at. And one area I'm thinking about is this maybe growing regulatory divergence between, often US-based, US multinationals that have maybe one set of regulations on one side of the Atlantic and a differentiated set on the other side of the Atlantic, and increasing, I guess, at least from what you hear from the likes of the US administration, is frustration with the regulatory environment in Europe, and Europe responding with the simplification regime. I guess, how does the IDA fit into this conversation, I guess?
Well, that's well, I suppose part of IDA's role is not to sort of, as I always say, build houses or build roads or water waste treatment plants or change regulation. Our job is to amplify the message that we hear from our client base and reflect it back to government saying, look, these are areas of concern. Regulation does come up a bit, there's no doubt about it. And again, when I talked about a kind of a big all-encompassing deal before the end of the year, I do think regulation will play a part in that. And some US companies make the valid point, we've no problem with regulation, but what we do have a problem is we produce all this data and then it just goes nowhere. And, you know, I think if Europe is serious about sort of cutting red tape, which the Commission have spoken about, I think areas where we've nearly got to go back to a zero-based approach and say, okay, what is this regulation here for? What are we trying to achieve? What is the data we're collecting at the moment? Are we using that data to try and fix the problem that we think we have? And if not, why are we doing it? And, you know, and I think the US are trying to take that approach as they approach deregulation at the moment. It's certainly something we need to do. And, you know, another hat I wear that's been put on me lately is Minister Chambers has appointed me to an infrastructure acceleration task force with it's basically our role is to try and accelerate take away some of the barriers to infrastructure. And some of the regulations we have in Ireland around infrastructure, you know, when you hear stories of it took 86 weeks to move a pylon owned by ESB on land to other land owned by ESB within the same parcel of land, you kind of think to yourself, okay, we haven't got this right. So I think it's probably a good time through competitiveness, through global divergence, to really look through, and this is more a common law issue. I mean, I think in a lot of cases on infrastructure, and this isn't just unique to Ireland, but those jurisdictions that come from a common law background, the right of the individual nearly carries more weight than the common good. I think if you look at some of the other European judicial systems, the common good overrides. Now, I'm not saying we throw everything out, but I think there are instances, and the planning bill, the Planning Act now will have dealt with some of this, but the idea of somebody, you know, 300 miles away objecting to something, you know, that can't be right. And I think so that divergence, I think it's a good time to see, can we start narrowing it internationally and simplifying it locally.
Does anyone have any questions? I don't want to kind of take up all the airspace. Does anyone? It's just
I have views on the Lions first test selection, on who'll win the All Ireland next weekend. Anything you want.
We have a gentleman over here, Seamus.
Hi there. Thanks, Feargal, for your comments. My name's David W. Higgins. I am an economist myself. I'm just wondering how you and the IDA are thinking about I suppose the delay in time that we're dealing with here, because when tariffs get implemented, they're first collected, that's only from April onwards, and then business decisions get made, and then that could be, you know, prices go up, it could be jobs get cut. Really, we could potentially be in the eye of a storm here. So I'd love to know how you and the IDA are thinking about how this might unfold and what the kind of delays in all of this could be.
Well, it's funny, one of the first things we did, so we launched our strategy with great fanfare about 2 weeks before President Trump was inaugurated, and all the tariffs came in. And one of the first things we did, as any business would do, is really sense-checked its strategy. Is our strategy still fit for purpose? And in our strategy, we have picked a couple of areas that we want. You know, IDA has been around for 76 years, done some things really well. So first thing we did is, okay, the two areas we've picked to focus on are healthcare, from soup to nuts, all the way down to from pharma, med tech, all the way down to health information. And the other is chip manufacture. And we looked at the ways we'd support our clients around sustainability and digital skills and AI. And actually, we said, you know, having reviewed it, we said, no, our strategy is still fit for purpose. Now let's look at what's happening on the ground in relation to tariffs. I think you're right. There is still an element of, you know, I was really looking for the first year numbers, job numbers, to see, is it still holding firm? And I suppose it is, but to my point, a lot of those decisions were taken at the back end of last year. So now, as I, you know, literally week by week chat to the chief executive and how are we doing, one thing you're probably saying, it doesn't feel like there's more jobs. But some companies say to us now, we're going to create these jobs. We don't want any publicity, thanks very much. whereas normally there'd be some sort of an announcement. So while it's still kind of minute by minute, we're still holding up well. The tax take is still holding up well. I think, at the start of this year, we had 302,000 people employed by foreign direct investment companies in Ireland out of a 2.88 million workforce. Another, depending on what factor you use, another 200 to 300,000 people indirectly employed. Of that, 2/3 are for US companies. If we got to the end of the year and we still had those numbers, I'd be very happy. And the tariffs, again, I'm not trying to downplay, I'm trying to put it in context. Our total exports of goods and services are in the region of 440 billion, of which 15% go to North America, of which 60% are pharma, where the real focus is on. So like a lot of how the year will play out will to a certain extent depend on how pharma is treated. So if, for argument's sake, there's an exemption from tariffs on pharma products and chip manufacture, I think we'll all breathe a sigh of relief. If at the beginning of August or into the Q3 and Q4, there's a significant tariff on pharma, I'd be interested to see how it plays out in the US, because there are some drugs where Ireland is the sole manufacturer, Botox being one, which people may be familiar with. You're probably all too young to be familiar with it. But how is the US going to do? They're still going to need Botox in the US, and will that cost be passed on to the consumer? Will it be passed on to the drugs purchase system in the US? So, like anybody who tells you they know what's going to happen, I don't think they do. And so what we're trying to do at the moment is literally keep close to our clients. So the IDA, the executives of the IDA would regularly talk to clients saying, what are you picking up in DC? What are your plans? What are your plans about future expansion? So it's a week by week process at the moment. And I think, at the end of the year, we'll have a hell of a better line of sight as to where we're going. Right now, it's educated guesswork, and that's about it. And keeping close to our clients so we kind of know what's going on in the front line.
Seamus, we have another question just there from Ciara.
Thank you very much. Hi, my name's Ciara Campbell. I'm a civil servant. So last year in the autumn, the Draghi report was published, which is all about how to renew and revive Europe's
Innovate.
competitiveness.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And out of that, the Europe's competitiveness compass was published in February of this year. So I'm wondering, what's your view about the proposed impact of these proposals and whether or not they'll really stimulate Europe's competitiveness? Thank you.
Yeah, it's funny because in a way, I think Draghi was in part an endorsement of the approach Ireland's taken in Europe over the last 20 or 30 odd years. We always believed in competition. We believed in fair competition, sometimes unfair, depending if you go back long enough on the tax front. But we believed, for example, in my previous competency, I would have said tax competition is very acceptable. Whereas committed Europeans might have said, no, tax competition is a bad thing. And I'm saying, no, it's not. It forces you to be more competitive around research and development or whatever. So in a way, I hope Draghi, everybody now says Draghi this is it. This is wonderful. We have a report. Now got to implement it. But I think we are seeing signs of that. We are seeing countries realizing that we need to be more competitive. We need to be better at attracting investment. We need to be getting better at promoting investment. But there's a lot of cultural change needs to take place to make that happen. So why do any companies, when they get to a certain size, go to the US to raise money, to do IPOs or whatever? Because the infrastructure isn't here, because the culture isn't here. The ecosystem, rather than the infrastructure. The ecosystem is here, the culture isn't here. I hope Draghi, if we fast forward 20 years, I hope Draghi will have been seen to be a line in the sand that led us to a new Europe that was much more competitively focused, much more investment aware. And I hope it was the starting gun for making Europe more effective and more efficient. And if that is the case, great. But I do think it gives Ireland the opportunity to sort of continue to preach the mantra of, foreign investment is a good thing, tax competition is a good thing. And if we can get agreement on a number of big picture issues, I mean, let's be honest. If Germany, the Germanys and the France of this world will end up writing the rules, and we'll be rule takers rather than rule makers. And if I hope a lot of those changes will be good for us, but it also means that Germany will suddenly decide, hey, we'd like to get the next Intel foundry publicly available. They went for it a couple of years ago, and I think it'll be trickier for us to get inward investment. But one of the reasons we focused on chip manufacturers, Europe has said we need to create chip manufacture within our own borders. And we're saying we've got a competency here. Fine, it's not a domestic competency, it's an international competency. But because primarily of Intel, but many other companies that operate here, we can be the center of chip manufacture for Europe. So I think drag is a good thing. I just hope now we implement it, and we implement it wholeheartedly. But I think it's good for Ireland overall.
I know I'm asking to take off the IDA hat and putting on the chair of the IIEA board hat. But so the first half of this event was called, focusing on competitiveness. But I want to focus on the last word, which is this uncertainty word.
Yeah.
And we find ourselves in this kind of, and you noted this already, as kind of period of end of globalization, supply chain dependencies, and I've even started to maybe not like the word uncertainty, because I think we're pretty certain that the international security environment is deteriorating. People are cooperating less. You see that kind of more competitive, but maybe more hostile approach, international environments. You see that kind of more standoffish approach between one side of the Atlantic and the other, between the US and Europe. And I guess maybe, and then also increasingly then on top of this, things such as microchips being seen as strategically important, economic security is increasing.
Rare earth materials, whatever else.
The conversation is shifting. And so I guess my question a little bit is, how do you see Ireland kind of navigating this uncertain times, maybe calamitous time, if things don't go well? How do you see Ireland navigate that economically, politically, socially?
Yeah, it's funny. And again, I'm conscious of the audience I'm talking to is a bit younger than I am. If I think over the last 15 years, the once in a lifetime events we've had included a global financial crisis, a pandemic, a war on European soil, and you're thinking, jeepers. So I'm grey-haired enough at this point to say, you know what, change and turbulence, where 15, 20 years ago was kind of, oh, wow, this has happened. Now it's kind of, okay, what's the crisis for this 4 or 5 years we're dealing with? And I think societies and businesses and hopefully individuals are more resilient than they might have been. And you layer on then all the technological change. So I think we're a bit more resilient. Do I think globalization has broken down? Yes, and it's probably, a simplistic view, but probably a relatively accurate view would be globalization made the world richer, but there were winners and losers. And I think in some political jurisdictions, some politicians have tapped into the disaffection of the losers, the people who have lost out. They've lost their jobs, they've lost their livelihoods. And, in many countries, economic nationalism has taken to the front again. And again, this is not new. If you go back, history effectively is repeating of cycles. This is not something that's happened for the first time. And we're dealing with that. Ireland's massively exposed because Ireland, in the wave of globalization that took place primarily over the 90s and into the 21st century, there was a coincidence of circumstances that led to our prosperity. The single market came about, which we had, instead of a local market of a couple of million people, we now had over 300 million people. We had a demographic, which meant we had a lot of younger people available to come into the workforce. We had a well-educated workforce, where, again, if I go back to my parents' time, going to college was something different. Wow, you're going to college. Whereas now it's almost the norm, and more so than any other European jurisdiction. So we had a well-educated workforce coming on stream. We had the rise of the internet, and the businesses that came forward, which were geographically agnostic. It didn't matter whether you were in a bedroom in Galway or in Vladivostok, you could service a particular niche or market. So we had US companies expanding abroad during the 90s, and every company born on the internet, Ireland's tax offering worked for it. So we had this absolutely convergence of a number of circumstances that all played well for us. And we really rode the wave for the last 20 or 30 years. I've been a small open economy, and the emerging single market, the fall of tariffs. So you nearly couldn't have written a better script for the kind of 20 years from 1990 to 2010. Global financial crisis, disaster, but most of the issues were of our own making in the Irish financial crash. But again, we got back on the saddle very quickly, and again helped by the fact that, again, most people won't remember, but like really what happened around that 2010 period was, in a sense, an internal devaluation. We were part of the euro, we couldn't devalue, but prices came down, groceries came down, rent came down, house prices, everything came down in price. So we got back on the saddle again. And when the economy took off pretty quickly globally, we were able to ride that wave again. But we are at a pivot point now. And that, we've seen off pandemics. We handled, as a society and a country, we handled the pandemic very well. I mean, keeping everybody in employment at that time, that was decided over a weekend with the Minister of Finance, the Taoiseach, the head of the Revenue Commissioners. Literally, they went into a room on a Friday and came out on a Sunday and said, we've got this scheme to keep everybody in employment. So we handled the pandemic well. We handled the post-crash well. But all of it was built on this open economy trading platform that's now under threat. And the thing that probably would concern me most is and it's recognized, but our over-dependence on corporation tax as a source of revenue to run the country. The fact that it's heavily concentrated, most the top 10 companies pay over 62 or 3% at this stage of the corporate tax take, but it's actually worse than that. It's a bit like the Premier League. It's actually the top 4 or 5 are really the big players in this. So the chill winds of uncertainty that are blowing around at the moment, we're kind of pretty exposed to that right now. But we're in good shape. We're in surplus again. We're putting money away for a rainy day, which is really helpful for, as the economists say, kind of counter-cyclical, hopefully, spending. We have effectively full employment. We have a pretty strong social contract. I think we're the second most redistributive economy in the OECD, where, if you go to the UK, you will find in some cities a level of poverty that you don't really find here because of the social welfare net. So we have a lot of positives going for us. But if there is some, at the end of the day, President Trump is a deal maker. He trades on it. There's a deal to be done. There's a deal to be done, I believe, for all sides can claim victory with a small v. And therefore, I think the balance of probabilities, you would say, there should be a deal done. If there isn't, and let's say we're here at Christmas and there's 30% tariffs in the EU, it's not just Ireland that's in trouble. It's Europe that's in trouble. It's the global trading sort of mechanism is in trouble. And the small comfort we have is we'll be coming at it from a position of strength, both financially and societally, that other countries will be disproportionately hit because of reliance on being an open economy. But at least we'll be doing it from a position of strength. And, I keep talking about the end of the year. The end of the year, I hope 2025 as the year, probably the year of greatest uncertainty, will hopefully be past us. And now we're looking to a little bit more for the years ahead, hopefully. But the next 6 months will tell a lot.
Here's hoping. I'll pause if anyone wants to maybe signal whether they'd like to ask any questions. I just want to see, do we have more than one question? Just we might take them in groups? No. Okay. Perfect.
Shy down at the back. I might start pointing at people and say.
So just, I suppose the most recent...
I'm so sorry. Would you mind just introducing who you are? Is that right?
Ben Daffron from the IMI.
Yeah.
Good to see you again, Feargal. I suppose the most recent OECD report from earlier this year, I think it was, highlighted a couple of, I suppose, issues or concerns, one of which was our over-reliance on certain FDI sectors, and one of which was our critical infrastructure and so on and so forth. And I can't remember if it was in the report itself or if it was some commentators saying this, but one of the big issues seems to be that Ireland has an issue with and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, with an entrepreneurial culture, and also with homegrown innovation. And you could potentially, that's very loaded sort of, comment to make, but I suppose someone could look at maybe Stripe and say, well, is that not a great example of Irish innovation? And you might say, well, no, Stripe are actually an American company who just happen to have Irish founders, And I suppose there is some concern as well at the wider level with when it comes to AI and the EU AI Act, and is that going to impede innovation in favor of this idea of Ireland being, or sorry, the EU being the leaders in ethical AI and so forth? But is there anything to that? Does Ireland have an issue with an entrepreneurial culture? Does Ireland and the EU generally have an issue when it comes to, I suppose, innovation generally? Because we know we do great with FDI and so forth, but maybe the homegrown isn't where it needs to be.
The comment, sometimes when I hear that comment, it's almost seems to be predicated on it's an either or. You can either have FDI or you can have homegrown entrepreneurship, but you can't have both. And I wouldn't accept that premise. I'd put on my IDA hat for a second and say, my job as chair of the IDA in part is to work with the chief executive and the organization to make sure we maximize foreign direct investment. And my colleagues over in our sister agency, EI, their job is to maximize domestic innovation, et cetera, et cetera. And I can't take off my blinkers and say, we should ease back this year, we're doing really well, and let the other lads catch up. Whether it's in sport or life or business, you just can't do that. But to your point about Stripe, and this is going back to the Draghi point I made earlier, if you've got a global idea, two great Irish guys, former young scientists have a global idea, the ability to raise serious money at valuations of billions, it's in Silicon Valley. It's not anywhere in Europe. And we don't have that ecosystem yet. So, from a European perspective, we lack the ecosystem for, I think if you count the top, 25 companies or the top 100 companies that have grown since 2000, they're all in the USA or China. Europe doesn't yet have that ecosystem. From a domestic Irish perspective, I see, and it's funny when you go on trade trips with EI, joint IDEI, or when you're talking to the Enterprise Ireland people, you hear some stories of companies, brilliant Irish companies. And part of the problem we have is, I'll get up on a little hobby horse here from my past life, is sometimes our tax system doesn't allow entrepreneurs to take a bit of money off the table and keep going. And by that I mean, there's a real med tech hub in the west of Ireland. A lot of US med tech companies have set up there. A lot of people have left those companies and set up their own Irish indigenous med tech companies. And they're going for 2 or 3 years. This is a great idea. And their former employer looks at them and says, wow, that's a really good idea. I'd buy the company for 10 million. And you're there and you're in your mid-30s and you've got a couple of kids and you've got a mortgage and you're thinking, maybe I'll just cash in my chips at this point. And I'd love if there was some way that the tax system facilitated them taking it. Because right now, if he wants or she wants to take money out of their company, they're taking dividends and paying income tax, so they're taking a big salary and taking income tax. I'd love if we had some system says if an entrepreneur wants to take money off the table and continue going, they would get capital gains tax rates. So I think, is the culture of innovation here in Ireland? Absolutely. I think the problem is it gets bought out too quickly. And understandably, sometimes these Irish entrepreneurs take money off the table. And I'd applaud the Collisons for saying, we're going to go to the US and we're going to make it big and we're going to make it global. I'd love to see more companies doing that, because I don't think it'll be at the expense of foreign direct investment at all. So is it there? Yes. Could we do more to foster it? Could Europe do more to foster it? Yes, definitely.
Do you have any additional hands? Great. So something that we've kind of seen is that, as Ireland has enjoyed this tremendous economic recovery after the financial crash, has been really, we're starting to see the limits of Ireland's kind of infrastructure. That's been, in terms of everything from waste,
water, power, offshore energy,
housing. All of Ireland's infrastructure is really, really straining. And there's this question of, to what extent, in your conversations with chief executives, is that really, because you see it in the media, right? But like in the conversation that you're having, how are these conversations really featuring? Are they, you know, where on the agenda items are they featuring in the conversation?
They're pretty top. And I mean, would I say there are red lights? No, but are there orange lights flashing? Yes, in a number of infrastructure areas. And, you know, as part of the Infrastructure Acceleration Task Force, there are 6 members appointed by Minister Chambers. He is chairing the group, a couple of his officials, the chief executives of the main utilities. And the plans are there. The issue is execution. And the issue is can we get out of the way in stopping ourselves doing these things? And if I look at infrastructure generally in Ireland, do we build things well? The answer is yes. We build things very well, whether it's a Terminal 2 or an M50 or a port tunnel. Do we build white elephants? We don't. There are some places you go in Europe and there's airports that nobody uses, or there's bridges to nowhere. I'm old enough to remember when the port tunnel was built, it started to spring a leak, or a small leak, and RT were down saying this is the end of the world, but it wasn't. It was brilliant. And like the port tunnel has been a godsend. I'm old enough to remember Michael Leary saying Terminal 2 would be a white elephant. Like, if we didn't have Terminal 2, what would life be like? So we build things well, we build the right things. We're just not good at building them quickly. And the issue for us is, if I talk, as I do at the task force, to the head of ESB Networks or Airgrid or Irish Water, they have the plans. I'm not saying money isn't an issue, because there has to be some prioritization in how you spend your money, but it's, you know, we're not facing the position of the 1980s or 90s where we actually didn't have the money to spend on infrastructure. So the money, generally speaking, is there, or we can get the money in. And the issue is, how do we quickly, for flagship projects like the Dublin wastewater treatment or Metro North or whatever, how do we actually say, well, instead of taking 10 years, that should take 4 years? How do we get out of the way? And it's funny, the Dublin the Children's Hospital is a classic, you know, because I want to learn, what are the lessons from the Dublin Children's Hospital? Because I think in 5 years' time, people will forget about the delay and the cost. They'll just say, we've got a world-class children's hospital in our city. But we need to learn the lessons for why it took so long and why it cost so much, so that when we do the other infrastructure projects, we're not making the same mistakes. And as I say, some of it's around planning, some of it's around a risk appetite within the civil service. And we've had this discussion. If I were a senior civil servant and I was asked to make a big infrastructure decision, and I think to myself, it's really important to get this decision right, because if I get it wrong, I could be flayed alive publicly in the Public Accounts Committee. It might be easier not to make a decision. So one of the things we've got to do is say to the civil servants, if you follow an appropriate process and you come to a decision, that decision may be wrong, that decision may be right. Life is like that, but that you won't get flayed alive at a Public Accounts Committee. So there's a variety of things we need to do to get out of the way and execute on these infrastructural projects. And like, you know, when I hear people say Ireland is full, I say to myself, okay, we still on the island of Ireland have not got back to the population we had in 1841. At a time when the population of the world was 1 billion rather than 8 billion, we are still the only country in the world that has fewer people now than we had in 1841. At that time, when we had 7.1 million people in the census, I think in 1841, on the island of Ireland, there were 17 million people in Great Britain. There are now 64 million people, I think, in Great Britain. And we have still less than we had on the island. So Ireland isn't full, but we need to upgrade our infrastructure. And it's not economic, it's societal. Unless we're building houses, unless we're building, getting offshore energy, and the opportunities are huge. And offshore energy, if we get it right on offshore energy, we can become an exporter of energy if we want. I don't think we should become an exporter of energy, just so we're clear, because I think that's a bit like back in the 1950s, for those of you who know your economics, we exported cattle on the hoof, and the value was given away to other countries who then slaughtered the cattle and did whatever. We should be saying, with all this surplus energy we have, why don't we get high energy users to come here? If we do this right, nobody will be talking about data centers in 5 years' time. We'll be attracting heavy use. Say, come to Ireland. We've got this green, reliable, affordable energy, and twice the capacity we have now. So execution and infrastructure, forget about tariffs, forget about trade or everything. Execution and infrastructure will be the single biggest determinant on whether we are going to be a successful economy from the middle of the next decade on. Get it right, we'll be hugely successful. Get it wrong, we will not be anywhere near as successful as we can be. So the next 5 to 7 years on infrastructure development are absolutely critical. And I suppose the good news is Minister Chambers and others, they're really up for it. They're really, and it could well be we'll take 4 or 5 flagship projects and saying, we're going to accelerate these, but we've got to make sure then we make the system easier for other projects coming through behind.
It really does kind of feel that sometimes we are on the cusp of this major national transformation that perhaps, and hopefully this is just growing pains that, you know, is.
Yeah, but like when you look at the past, like when you look at Ardnagh Crusher, which was built in 1927, it consumed 30% of GDP, I think, that year. I mean, it was a brave, bold move by the government of the day to say, you know, we're going to transform the country. We've got to take those bold decisions. Part of the problem is now we're bigger and we're not as nimble as we might have been 20 years ago in making the system work. We've got so successful, the system's a lot bigger. There's a lot more checks and balances. Going back to infrastructure, a lot of us, if we can get out of the way of ourselves, I think we can advance in infrastructure. But again, in the same way I said the next 6, 7 years are going to be really important for infrastructure development. The next 5 or 6 months are going to be really important that when we go to Cabinet with the report from that group, that Cabinet act upon it, and then we can see genuine sort of cutting of red tape to accelerate some of these infrastructure projects hugely.
We have about 15 minutes left, so I'd like everyone to start thinking about questions. Just be shame for anyone to miss out on this chance. Seamus.
Researcher here at the Institute. Just a question for myself on the European policy framework. What are your thoughts on the kind of the changes that we've been seeing when it comes to industrial policy? And I think you mentioned it earlier, some countries are taking a more activist approach when it comes to industrial policy. And do you have thoughts on what that means for us and in Europe? And in particular, when it comes to things like, say, you mentioned the CHIPS Act, and now there's talk about a second European CHIPS Act or a new version of it. Just your thoughts on those.
Yeah, I mean, the CHIPS Act kind of works and kind of doesn't work, and I think it needs to be revisited. But like, part of me smiles and says, you know, IDEA have been doing this for 76 years, and finally other European countries saying, foreign direct investment, that's a great idea. Why didn't we think of it before now? And we're saying, God, you know, not saying we had the pitch to ourselves, but I see a plus and a minus. A plus is that, you know, we're never going to be able to match the incentives. If Germany really wants a project, Germany's going to get that, and they will be able to throw a level of resources at it that we wouldn't be able to afford. Not that we wouldn't pick our battles, and you know, there'll be a time, I suspect, where we will go to the well and say we really want this project. So at one level, more competition with deeper pockets, probably not good for Ireland. But at the same time, I think Europe is waking up to the fact that you've got to be competitive to win foreign direct investment, and I think that more open approach to sort of saying we've got to get these companies in will probably help for us. And I think a lot of it is, you know, sometimes European countries give it out to us saying, you know, you guys, having unanimity in tax is not good. We should be allowed to change tax with qualified majority. No, I actually think we're dead right to hold the line on, for example, a competency like tax, because it allows us to be more competitive. And I think tax competition, as one example, is a good thing. So net, there's negatives, there's positives, but if Europe is geared up to try and attract more foreign direct investment, I think that will help us. And one of the numbers that really I was delighted to see this year is that when we looked at our numbers for the first half for effectively our first half 2025 in the IDA, the number of European headquarter jobs that were announced here is on the up. So while the US is the 800-pound gorilla, as I say, it counts for 2/3 of the jobs here. You know, there's a world out there, both within Europe and indeed in Asia Pac, where we can do more and we can do better. America has been low-hanging fruit for us for many years. It'll always be the 800-pound gorilla for us. But I think trying to attract investment from elsewhere in Europe and in Asia, and if Europe is up for more inward investment, net, I think it's good for us. Not one question on rugby yet. It's terrible. So there's 2 there, yeah. I'll take the 2.
Hi, my name's Daniel. I'm a investor in AIB, working on climate capital. So we invest in infrastructure.
One of Colin Hunt's big things, yeah.
It is, that's the team. I had a question in relation to Ireland's competitiveness going forward. Do you have any comment on how any potential reunification with the North would play into that? Bit of a can of worms I'm throwing at you, of course, but figured I'd ask.
Second question somewhere there. Yeah.
Sorry, referring back to the infrastructure topic there, I suppose first part of the question is, do you believe that the IDA has a voice in the discussion around facilitating more data centers in Ireland? And second part being, would you personally agree that the increased anchorage and integration of big tech through data centers is worth the resource strain that they can have on Ireland and on the impact of more housing?
Yeah, I always prefer focusing on what we can agree on rather than what we can't agree on. I think everybody agrees data centers are a good thing in of themselves. I think everybody would agree that data centers are, as you put it rightly, an anchor, and every, if you look at your phone, you look at it, all this runs through data centers. And I think from my past life in PwC and my current life, I do believe they affect ancillary investment decisions as well around the organization towards center of that. I think we all agree that if we get to where we want to get to by 2032, 33 on offshore wind energy in particular and renewable energy, data centers won't be a problem. And don't forget, I sometimes say this to people are kind of looking at me, where, if we want to harness all this offshore wind, the people supplying will say, where's the demand, right? Because if there's no demand, we're not going to build these offshore farms. So part of us, and part of that demand will come from society, growth in population, growth in electric vehicles, etc. But also, again, I'm old enough to remember the start of my career where, the ESB were saying, we need more demand. So what we're not agreed on data centers is it's going to be lumpy in the middle. In other words, here in 2025, we know where we want to get to in 2033 in terms of offshore wind energy. It won't be a problem. But the growth in demand and the growth in supply of such energy could over and back. And I think what the government are saying now is, look, we want to be practical about this over the next few years, because at the end of the day, if we want to transform our society and our economy and decarbonize, it's going to cost money. And the best way we can pay for that is to keep Ireland as an investment hub for all these companies who continue to pay tax, which will enable us to transform our economy and our society. And for example, the government's decision to facilitate an LNG plant storage area on the west coast, I think is a demonstration of that practicality. Sure, from a climate point of view, you want to move away from LNG, but as a method of bridging it over the next couple of years, do I think the government made the right decision? I do think they made the right decision. So I think if you're purist about it, you'd say we can have no more data centers because we've got to get our renewables up. The practical part of me would say, yeah, accept that, but it's not going to be an absolute lockstep over the next couple of years. And I think we've got to try and live with that and accommodate it as much as we can. On the issue of United Ireland, I'd refer you to an excellent paper produced by the IIEA about 6 months ago, would it be, or more? Yeah. We produced it's really interesting. It's, again, if I put on my IIEA hat and take off my IDA hat for a second, the amount of overlap on the island is actually higher than you think. There are many instances where, we've talked to our sister organization, InvestNI, and said, there are ways we can work together, particularly for projects around the border. And there are some projects they wouldn't just have the bandwidth to do. There are some projects where we're in competition on. United Ireland, at one level, it's above my pay grade, certainly as chairman of IDA. But a lot of it is about practical cooperation, and certainly practical cooperation on an economic front happens quite a lot, and more often than you can see and think. And I think more so now since Stormont has got up and running a year and a half ago now, you're seeing more practical approaches to this. So will I see United Ireland in my lifetime? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. But will I see more enhanced cooperation, hearts and minds over the next 20 or 30 years or 40 years, depending how long I live? Yeah, I do. And I expect to see more, and I hope I'll see more. And, the fact that the Open, the British Open, is going to be held in the Republic of Ireland in a few years' time, I mean, that's a big deal, you know, at a cultural level. So, you know, economically, is it to the forefront of my thinking? No, but there are occasions where, in fact, the head of Invest NI is a former IDA Ireland executive. So, you know, do we talk to them? Do we, you know, cooperate where appropriate? Yes. And will that continue? Yes, it will. And there'll be more and more cross-border cooperation economically over the years, the further we go, you know.
I'm becoming conscious of time, so this might actually be our last round of questions.
I'll try and shorten my answers then.
No, not at all. But if anyone has any questions, we've won there. If you have any more, we might go with that one, then I have one more question.
Oh, yeah, we'll take with another one, yeah, whatever.
Hi, my name is Drew. I'm a planner with the NTA. One of my questions around infrastructure delivery is, what are your views on perhaps a decentralization of powers from central government back to the regional authorities and local government? Because a lot of decisions, I'm sure, get tied up in delays primarily at the central government end of the process. So what would your view be towards a return to a more decentralized process or back towards the regional authorities?
Yeah, it's really funny because you can argue it both ways. Housing is decentralized, and yet you find different county councils taking different views on the same planning regulations, and you say, oh, this must be a nightmare because there's not a consistent view. But your counterpoint is, yeah, but when it gets all centralized, it gets slower to do. I genuinely, and I know in my past life when I was doing an organizational restructure at one point, and somebody said to me, you're going back exactly the way it was 10 years ago. And I said, I know. And 10 years ago, that was the right answer. And then it was the wrong answer. Now it's the right answer again. So times change and circumstances change. I don't think you can say forever, always the right answer is decentralization to local. There'll be times where it is the right answer. There'll be times where it's clearly the wrong answer. The trick is actually understanding where the barriers are. And if the particular structure at the time is wrong, changing that structure. I actually think we've got to, the point we've got to now around infrastructure is the recognition is so obvious that we're better off keeping it centrally at the moment, because centrally now at least we're able to say, and I mean, some people are arguing we should take planning away from councils and bring it back for housing and bring it back up centrally. So you can have I'm not sure if that's the right view, but for major national infrastructure projects, I think you've got to bring it, and that includes roads, you've got to bring it up to a central authority. And I think the recognition of the severity of the issue we face in infrastructure is such at the moment that at least if the issues are centralized, you have a better chance of breaking the logjam from the center, as opposed to trying to go down to various local bodies or authorities and getting them to change it. But somebody may come back in 15 years' time and say, you know what, now is the time, and here's the reason why it's the right time. Right now, I do believe it is centrally.
So my final question just probably relates to, we see in the media at the moment, there's a lot of discussion around the Occupied Territories Bill. It's potentially, which is, if you're not familiar with this is the bill that would ban trade between Ireland and occupied territories in the West Bank. And I guess there's a lot of kind of potential concerns around what that might mean for the US anti-boycott laws and how that might affect Ireland's multinational sector here. For you in your conversations with chief executives, how is that actually featuring in these conversations, in terms of either orders or priorities, just in terms of concerns? Are there any thoughts that you have on this and how it might be implemented?
Well, I suppose, putting on my IDA hat, I play a bit of golf badly. One of the rules you learn in golf is you play the ball as it lies. It doesn't matter, you might be in the bunker, you might be in the middle of the fairway, you got to play it where it lies. So if the government decide to amend that legislation, that's the backdrop we play against. I can honestly say, in discussions I've had with companies or groupings or whatever over the last 18 months, has it been mentioned a few times? Yes. Has it been mentioned in the top 5 or 6 issues? No. I mean, people want to talk about power, they want to talk about housing, they want to talk about water. There's a lot of things they get through before the few companies they mention to get to that. It's a matter of uncontroversial fact that there is a very strong Israeli lobby in the US. It's very powerful, it's very effective. I would take my hat off to them. We always think, like, when you're over in the White House on St. Patrick's Day, you're looking around saying, aren't we brilliant for such a small country to have this access? And Israel do the same, and even more of it, and even better. And I think it'll affect the mood music in a bit, because Ireland, if this legislation comes to pass, what it looks like it will give people a stick to say Ireland is anti-Israel. And in some quarters of the US, that won't play well. But look, at the end of the day, nearly every company I speak to, they are interested in how will Ireland do for them? Will Ireland help them make a profit? Will Ireland help them make more money? And, you know, over the 76 years the IDA has been in existence, and even going longer back in that, when Henry Ford set up a factory in Cork to make cars many, many, many years ago. Like, Americans like Ireland. They like it because there's a cultural similarity. They like it because of the diaspora that went over there over the last 180 years. They like us because we understand them, we understand their culture. We like it because Ireland works for American companies. There's a number which always fascinates me, and it's held true for the last years. 2/3 of all new investment in Ireland every year comes from existing companies here already. And when you think about that number, it's a real baby bear's porridge number. It's lovely, because you want the companies that are here to say, Ireland's really working well for us, let's make another investment. And yet you want to refresh the inventory of companies, so you want to be attracting new names. So if you're getting a 2/3, 1/3 split for new investment, you've a lot of companies saying, Ireland works, we're going to double down, we're going to double again. And you've a lot of new companies saying, wow, Ireland must be really good because everybody else is there. So, you know, in the overall scheme of things, it's an economic and cultural affinity that the US have here. It works for US companies. It's worked for many, many decades. It'll work for many, many more decades. And irrespective of what the landscape is around that, I've no doubt, you know, if we can get the trade tariffs issue out of the way and we solve our infrastructure issues right, we'll have a really successful next decade when it comes to attracting inward investment, and particularly US investment.
Well, we're unfortunately out of time for this conversation.
And I'm not rushing off, so.
Oh no, but I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to speak with the Young Professionals Network. Again, to all of you who are here for the first time, welcome. To all of you who are returning, welcome back.